Toronto, 6 a.m. The skyline is etched in steel and glass, a monument to a decade of unprecedented growth. In the quiet suburbs of Brampton, Vancouver, and Halifax, the lights are coming on. But for hundreds of thousands of Canadians, the morning doesn't bring promise. It brings a cold, calculated dread. For 20 years, Canada has been an outlier, a nation that seemingly defied the laws of economic gravity. While the rest of the world shuddered during the 2008 financial crisis, we doubled down. We bought the bigger homes, the newer SUVs, and the lifestyle promised by cheap credit. But today, the math has changed. The Bank of Canada's interest rate hikes have turned a manageable burden into a suffocating weight. This is no longer about numbers on a balance sheet or abstract policy debates in Ottawa. This is about the quiet evaporation of the middle class. We are living on borrowed time, and the bill has finally come due. Across the country, a silent crisis is unfolding behind closed doors, a debt trap decades in the making.
The evidence of the shift is no longer buried in spreadsheets. It is visible in the lived reality of Canadian households. By the end of 2025, the ratio of household debt to disposable income has remained stubbornly high at approximately 177%. For every dollar of take-home pay, Canadians are carrying nearly $1.80 in debt, a burden that leaves virtually no margin for error. While the Bank of Canada has pivoted to a 2.25% policy rate, the relief has yet to reach those approaching the Renewal cliff. Mortgage delinquency rates, which stayed dormant for decades, are now creeping upward, particularly in the overextended suburbs of Ontario and British Columbia. In September 2025 alone, consumer insolvency filings surged by over 10% year over year, marking one of the highest volumes in Canadian history. This is not a crisis driven by mass unemployment, but by the weight of over-leverage. The middle class is being squeezed by the sheer cost of carrying the debt that once financed their standard of living. Across the country, families are quietly choosing between the mortgage payment and the rising cost of essentials as the buffer of cheap credit finally evaporates.
The engine of this crisis is the mortgage renewal cycle, a slow-motion collision between past indulgence and present reality. Between 2020 and 2022, Canadians flooded the housing market, fueled by emergency low interest rates, often below 2%. By late 2025, that era has definitively ended. Nearly 60% of all outstanding Canadian mortgages are slated for renewal between now and the end of 2026. Even with the Bank of Canada holding its policy rate at 2.25%, the transition is jarring. A homeowner renewing a 5-year fixed mortgage today faces a payment shock of 15 to 20% on average. For a family in the Greater Toronto Area, this translates to hundreds, sometimes thousands of additional dollars required every month just to keep the same roof overhead. This is the wealth effect in reverse. As disposable income is diverted into interest payments, the broader economy feels the chill. Retail sales are softening, and the robust 2.6% GDP growth seen in the third quarter of 2025 is already showing signs of a sharp fourth quarter cooling. The math of the Canadian dream is being rewritten, one renewal notice at a time.
To understand the gravity of the Canadian situation, one must look south to the American experience of 2008. When the U.S. housing bubble burst, it triggered a global contagion. But Canada was largely spared, buoyed by conservative lending and high resource prices. That immunity, however, may have been a double-edged sword. While Americans deleveraged and rebuilt their balance sheets over a decade of pain, Canadians did the opposite. We treated the 2008 reprieve not as a warning, but as a green light. Today, the disconnect between housing prices and local incomes in cities like Vancouver and Toronto far exceeds the levels seen in Las Vegas or Miami at their 2006 peaks. In the U.S. crash, the crisis was driven by subprime borrowers. In Canada, the vulnerability lies within the prime market, the gainfully employed middle class who followed every rule but the one concerning over-leverage. The historical parallels with the 1989-1990 Canadian bubble are also resurfacing. Back then, it took 7 years for prices to bottom out. This time, the debt load is nearly 4 times larger, and the safety net of falling interest rates has been replaced by a persistent inflationary ceiling that limits the central bank's room to maneuver.
The Canadian condition is not an isolated phenomenon. It is an acute symptom of a global realignment. For nearly 15 years, the world's central banks maintained a policy of easy money, essentially suppressing the cost of risk. In nations like Australia, Sweden, and Canada, this sparked a domestic arms race for real estate. Unlike the hyperinflationary collapses seen in Argentina or the Turkish lira's freefall, where currency devaluation erodes purchasing power, the Canadian crisis is one of stagnation and interest rate sensitivity. We're seeing a balance sheet recession, a term popularized during Japan's lost decades. When households are preoccupied with paying down debt, they stop spending elsewhere. This creates a feedback loop. Lower consumer demand leads to business closures, which leads to layoffs, which further weakens the ability to service debt. The Greek debt crisis taught us that austerity is a blunt instrument that can hollow out a nation's social fabric. While Canada is not Greece, the rising cost of servicing public and private debt means that a larger share of the national GDP is now being diverted away from innovation and infrastructure simply to pay for the past.
As consumers pull back, the secondary effects begin to ripple through the corporate sector, exposing a fragile business landscape. In late 2025, business investment in Canada has hit a significant low, excluding the anomaly of the pandemic years. Capital that should be flowing into technology, machinery, and research is instead being sucked into the vacuum of debt servicing. This is Canada's productivity trap. When the cost of housing absorbs nearly 50% of a young professional's income, the incentive for entrepreneurship and risk-taking vanishes. Canada's Big Six banks, once the envy of the global financial world for their stability, are now significantly increasing their provisions for credit losses. These are billions of dollars set aside specifically to cover the rising tide of potential defaults, a move that directly impacts bank liquidity and tightens the taps for small business loans. Unemployment, which remained historically low for years, is beginning to tick upward as the construction and retail sectors, 2 pillars of the debt-fueled boom, begin to contract under the pressure of high carrying costs. The economy is no longer just cooling, it is undergoing a painful structural realignment where the ghost of past growth haunts the prospects of future stability.
Behind the macroeconomic data lies a profound human cost. On suburban kitchen tables from Surrey to Mississauga, the math of survival is being recalculated every month. For many, the home equity line of credit, once viewed as a convenient ATM for renovations and vacations, has become a desperate lifeline. As interest rates spiked, these revolving credit facilities turned into predatory traps, with monthly interest-only payments often doubling overnight. We are witnessing the hollowing out of the Canadian middle class. High-income professionals, once shielded from financial insecurity, are now accessing debt relief services and frequenting food banks in record numbers. The psychological toll of this lifestyle debt is immense, manifesting in a mental health crisis tied directly to the threat of insolvency. For those facing the loss of a family home, the shame is often as debilitating as the financial ruin. In 2025, the stigma of bankruptcy is being replaced by a grim, shared reality. The dream of homeownership, long the cornerstone of Canadian identity, has transformed into a source of chronic anxiety, leaving a generation wondering if they were sold a bill of goods they can no longer afford to keep. The halls of the Bank of Canada in Ottawa are quiet, but the atmosphere is charged with a difficult reality. For the Governing Council, the path to a soft landing has become an increasingly narrow tightrope. Throughout 2025, the central bank has been caught in a vice. If they cut rates too aggressively to save over-leveraged homeowners, they risk reigniting inflation and devaluing the Canadian dollar against a surging U.S. greenback. If they keep rates restrictive, they risk a systemic collapse as the mortgage renewal cliff approaches. Meanwhile, on Parliament Hill, the federal government faces its own fiscal reckoning. Public debt servicing costs have ballooned to levels not seen in decades, eating into the tax revenue desperately needed for healthcare and infrastructure. Critics argue that years of deficit spending during the low-rate era left the national balance sheet vulnerable to this exact shock. Now the government is forced to balance the need for social support with the cold reality of limited fiscal room. It is a moment of profound institutional tension, where the tools of the past, more debt and lower rates, are no longer available to solve the problems they helped create. The policy of wait and see has reached its expiration date. The strain is perhaps most visible in the rental market, a sector often overlooked in discussions of mortgage renewals, but deeply interconnected. As homeowners face escalating costs, many are forced to hike rents to cover their own interest payments, passing the debt burden onto a demographic already at its breaking point. In urban centers like Vancouver and Toronto, the average one-bedroom apartment now consumes over 60% of a median pre-tax income. This creates a dangerous ripple effect. When the floor of the housing market, the renters, cannot afford to live, the entire structure becomes unstable. We are seeing a new phenomenon of renter insolvency, where young professionals with stable jobs are defaulting on credit cards just to keep a roof over their heads. This isn't just a housing problem, it is a labor mobility crisis. When people cannot afford to move for work, the economy loses its dynamism. The social contract that promised a better life through hard work is fraying, replaced by a tiered system where your financial survival depends less on your salary and more on when you entered the real estate market. The divide between the haves and the have-nots has become a divide between the leveraged and the priced out. As 2025 draws to a close, the fragility of the Canadian financial landscape has been further complicated by a volatile international trade environment. The sudden escalation of bilateral U.S.-Canada tariffs in mid-2025 sent shockwaves through integrated supply chains, forcing the national economy into a modest recession. For the average household, this macroeconomic friction translates into a singular, devastating vulnerability: job security. While inflation has cooled toward the 2% target, the unemployment rate has climbed to 6.8% as of December. In a high-debt environment, the loss of a single paycheck is no longer a temporary setback, it is a systemic failure. The Financial Resilience Index now suggests that nearly 60% of Canadians find their current income insufficient to cover the trifecta of housing, food, and utilities. With the personal saving rate dipping to 5.7%, the cushion that protected many through the pandemic has been depleted. We are now seeing the convergence of a trade-induced slowdown and a domestic debt peak, a combination that leaves the middle class with fewer places to turn as their primary asset, the family home, begins to lose value in a cooling market. The crisis has forced a radical rethinking of the Canadian banking sector, long considered a bastion of global stability. As we move into 2026, the Big Six banks are grappling with a phenomenon rarely seen in the post-war era: a sustained contraction in mortgage demand combined with a rise in non-performing loans. The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, OSFI, has responded by tightening the stress test even further, a move intended to protect the system, but one that inadvertently traps existing homeowners. Many find themselves mortgage prisoners, unable to switch lenders for a better rate because they no longer qualify under the stricter new rules. This lack of competition in the lending market has allowed banks to keep spreads high, even as the Bank of Canada signals further easing. Meanwhile, the shadow banking sector, private lenders who operate with less oversight, has seen its market share double. These lenders often charge interest rates in the double digits, attracting those who have been rejected by traditional institutions. It is a desperate gamble. For many, these high-interest bridge loans are the last stop before a forced sale or foreclosure, signaling a fragmentation of the national credit market. The historical echoes of the 1989-1990 Canadian real estate crash are becoming impossible to ignore. During that era, a combination of double-digit interest rates and a global slowdown led to a decade-long stagnation in property values. Today, while the rates are numerically lower, the sheer volume of debt makes a 5% mortgage today feel as heavy as a 12% mortgage did 35 years ago. The current affordability index is at its worst level in 40 years, surpassing the peaks of the late 80s. In cities like Toronto, real home prices are beginning a slow, painful correction, dropping by 12% in real terms over the last 18 months. Unlike the sudden pop of a bubble seen in the United States in 2008, Canada is experiencing a slow puncture. This is more dangerous in many ways, as it erodes equity over years, leaving homeowners trapped in properties that are worth less than the debt attached to them. This negative equity trap is already taking hold in the condo markets of the GTA and the Lower Mainland, where investors, who once fueled the construction boom, are now offloading units at a loss, further driving down the floor of the market.
By the final days of 2025, the wealth effect that fueled the Canadian economy for 2 decades has officially shifted into reverse. The Bank of Canada's decision on December 10th to hold the policy rate at 2.25% confirms a new era of stagnation. The rate-cutting cycle has stalled, but the neutral rate remains significantly higher than the emergency lows of the pandemic. For the 60% of mortgage holders renewing through 2026, the reality is a permanent increase in carrying costs. While variable rate holders see some relief, the 40% of the market held in 5-year fixed contracts is hitting a wall, with average payment shocks of 15 to 20%. In Ontario, consumer insolvencies have reached levels not seen since the 2009 Great Recession, and the homeowners bankruptcy index has climbed to nearly 10%. The buffer of the Bank of Mom and Dad, which supported 70% of buyers over the last 2 years, is finally running dry. Canada enters 2026 not with a bang, but with a quiet, systemic tightening, as a nation that built its identity on rising home equity begins the long, difficult process of living within its means.
In the first half of 2026, the long-anticipated renewal wave reaches its absolute crest. Financial analysts have dubbed this period the peak of the shock, as it marks 5 years since the ultra-low interest rate environment of early 2021. Back then, nearly half of all new mortgages were signed at rates below 2%. Now, those same homeowners are being funneled into a market where 5-year fixed rates have settled near 4.3%. While the Bank of Canada's easing cycle has prevented a total catastrophe, the jump is still profound. For a family with a $600,000 mortgage, this shift represents a mandatory payment increase of approximately $800 to $1,000 per month. This isn't just a number, it is the entire discretionary budget of a middle-class household, gone. The result is a retail ghost town effect in suburban malls across the country. As June 2026 approaches, the sheer volume of these renewals is creating a massive drain on the national economy, shifting billions of dollars from consumer goods into the interest-bearing accounts of financial institutions. The resilience of the Canadian homeowner is being tested at a scale never before seen in the post-war era. As the crisis deepens into the summer of 2026, the political landscape is shifting under the weight of public outcry. Provincial governments, particularly in Ontario and British Columbia, are being forced into a defensive posture as the Tenant-Homeowner Alliance demands intervention. In Toronto, the municipal government has declared a housing emergency, not just due to lack of supply, but due to the rapid acceleration of forced sales. Provincial legislatures are debating temporary moratoriums on foreclosures for primary residences, a move that has sent tremors through the financial sector. The Bank of Canada, meanwhile, finds itself in an impossible bind. Any further rate cuts to ease the burden on homeowners risk devaluing the Canadian dollar to a point where imported inflation, especially in food and energy, could skyrocket.
The federal government's fiscal update in early 2026 revealed a deficit that has widened significantly as tax revenues from a cooling real estate market evaporate. This is the fiscal trap of the debt crisis. The government needs to spend to provide a social safety net, yet its own debt servicing costs are consuming the very resources required to do so. The nation's credit rating, once a point of pride, is now under negative outlook by major international agencies. As the nation grapples with the fallout of the 2026 renewal wave, a shift in the Canadian psyche is taking place. Survival in this new economic climate requires more than just resilience. It requires a cold, tactical reassessment of the family balance sheet. Financial advisors are increasingly urging households to move beyond simple budgeting and adopt a corporate approach to personal finance. This means prioritizing liquidity over home equity, a radical departure for a culture that has long viewed the family home as a piggy bank. We are seeing a surge in debt stacking strategies, where Canadians consolidate high-interest credit card debt into their lower-rate mortgages during the renewal window, sacrificing future equity to survive today's cash flow crunch. For others, the strategy is more drastic, downsizing or moving to less expensive provinces to escape the leverage trap of the major urban centers. The era of the forever home is being replaced by the era of the sustainable home, as Canadians realize that in an environment of 4% interest, the cost of carrying excess space is a luxury they can no longer afford.
The crisis has reached a point where the traditional safety nets are being pushed to their absolute limits. In mid-2026, the demand for debt restructuring and credit counseling services has increased by 45% compared to the previous year. Nonprofit organizations and credit bureaus are reporting a significant rise in multigenerational insolvency, where parents who co-signed on their children's homes during the 2021 frenzy are now finding their own retirements at risk. This is the contagion of the co-signer. When the primary borrower fails to meet the increased payment, the debt flows backward, threatening the assets of the older generation. To survive, some are turning to equity harvesting, selling off a portion of their home's value to investment firms in exchange for immediate cash flow, a high-risk strategy that effectively turns the homeowner into a tenant in their own house. Others are adopting a hardcore austerity mindset, cutting all non-essential spending to zero. This collective retreat from the consumer economy is visible in the data. Discretionary spending in Canada has fallen for 6 consecutive quarters, the longest contraction since the early 1980s. The survival strategy for the 2026 household is not about growth, it is about defensive positioning.
The year 2026 has become the ultimate testing ground for the stress test that was designed to prevent this very scenario. Ironically, while the test ensured borrowers could handle 5% rates on paper, it didn't account for the 25% increase in the cost of groceries and utilities that occurred simultaneously. This is the hidden leverage of the modern Canadian life. To keep their homes, many are now forced into the gig economy hustle, taking on secondary and tertiary jobs just to cover the interest gap. We are seeing a demographic of wealthy poor Canadians, individuals who own a $1 million asset but have less than $200 in their bank account at the end of the month. The survival strategy is no longer about building wealth, it is about treading water. This has led to a surge in private lending, unregulated MICs, or mortgage investment corporations, that are stepping in where big banks won't. For those with no other options, these lenders offer a temporary reprieve at 10 or 12% interest, a desperate gamble that assumes rates will plummet or prices will skyrocket before the next term is up.
As the autumn of 2026 sets in, the Canadian economy enters a phase of forced deleveraging. This is the clinical term for a process that is, in reality, deeply messy and personal. For over a decade, the growth of the national GDP was inextricably linked to the growth of housing prices. Now that link has become a noose.
The Bank of Canada's October 2026 report reveals a stark truth. For the first time in a generation, the average Canadian household is actively reducing its total debt load, but not by choice. It is happening through a wave of power of sale proceedings and voluntary liquidations. In cities like Calgary and Edmonton, which had initially been shielded by energy prices, the contagion has finally arrived as the national credit squeeze dries up interprovincial migration. The wealth effect has been replaced by equity anxiety. Economists are beginning to compare this period to the 1990s in Japan, a long, slow grinding down of expectations. The Big Reset is no longer a fringe theory, it is the official forecast. The country is learning a painful lesson about the limits of debt-fueled prosperity, as the focus shifts from how much can I borrow to how quickly can I pay it back. As the calendar turns to early 2026, the soft landing narrative has been replaced by a structural adjustment. The Bank of Canada, having held its policy rate at 2.25%, has signaled that the era of emergency stimulus is over. For many, this is the final realization that the high-interest environment is not a temporary storm to be weathered, but a permanent climate change. The reset is most visible in the divergence of the housing market. While single-family homes in Quebec City and the prairies show modest resilience, the condo markets in Toronto and Vancouver are facing a reckoning. Prices for high-density units in the GTA are forecast to decline by another 6.5% through 2026, as investors, squeezed by negative cash flow, flood the market with inventory. This investor exodus is the missing piece of the deleveraging puzzle. For a generation that viewed real estate as a guaranteed 10% annual return, the shift to a stagnating or declining market is psychologically shattering. The focus has moved from building equity to minimizing loss, a defensive posture that will define the Canadian economy for the remainder of the decade.
By 2027, the great deleveraging begins to produce a new, more sober social equilibrium. The frantic pace of the previous decade has been replaced by a long plateau, where home values remain stagnant in real terms. For many Canadians, the psychological transition is the hardest, the realization that their home is once again a place to live rather than a high-yield investment vehicle. We see the rise of the generation of the shared roof, as high housing costs and a tightening labor market lead to a permanent increase in multi-generational living and co-living arrangements among professionals. This is not merely a survival tactic, it is becoming a cultural shift toward collective resilience. In the labor market, the low-hire, low-fire dynamic persists, with workers prioritizing job security and recess-proofing their skills in sectors like healthcare, green technology, and specialized trades. Canada is emerging from the crisis with a more balanced, albeit leaner, economic identity. The era of easy credit has ended, replaced by a national focus on productivity, fiscal prudence, and the slow, steady work of rebuilding the middle class without the crutch of over-leverage. By mid-2027, the structural adjustment phase concludes, leaving a transformed Canadian economic identity in its wake. The Bank of Canada's policy rate has found its new floor at 2.25%, a level that feels restrictive to some but is historically neutral. The real story, however, is the productivity pivot. Having been burned by the real estate collapse, domestic capital is finally flowing away from unproductive housing speculation and into high-speed sectors, advanced manufacturing, agriculture technology, and AI-driven services. This is Canada's attempt to close the widening prosperity gap with its neighbors. The labor market has stabilized with an unemployment rate of approximately 6.2%, but the nature of work has changed. Workers now prioritize roles in export-oriented industries that offer inflation-hedged wages. The new Canadian normal. The debt-to-income shift. The national household debt-to-disposable income ratio has finally begun a sustained descent, projected to dip below 160% as Canadians prioritize repayment over consumption. Housing as a utility.
Real estate has returned to its status as a slow-growth asset. In major hubs like Toronto, the market has cleared, with prices stabilizing roughly 20% below their 2022 peaks, finally allowing a new cohort of buyers to enter. Institutional prudence. The Big Six banks have emerged leaner, having survived the renewal cliff through aggressive amortization extensions and debt restructuring programs that are now standard industry practice.
By early 2027, the great deleveraging begins to produce a new, more sober social equilibrium. The frantic pace of the previous decade has been replaced by a long plateau, where home values remain stagnant in real terms. For many Canadians, the psychological transition is the most difficult, the realization that their home is once again a place to live rather than a high-yield investment vehicle. We are seeing the rise of the generation of the shared roof. High housing costs and a tightening labor market have led to a permanent increase in multi-generational living and professional co-living arrangements. This is not merely a survival tactic, it is a cultural shift toward collective resilience. In the labor market, a low-hire, low-fire dynamic persists, with workers prioritizing job security and recess-proofing their skills in sectors like healthcare, green technology, and specialized trades. The 2027 economic landscape. The productivity pivot. Domestic capital is finally flowing away from unproductive housing speculation and into high-speed sectors, advanced manufacturing, agriculture technology, and AI-driven services. The debt-to-income shift. The national household debt-to-disposable income ratio has finally begun a sustained descent, projected to dip below 160% as Canadians prioritize repayment over consumption. Housing as a utility. Real estate has returned to its status as a slow-growth asset. In major hubs like Toronto, the market has cleared, with prices stabilizing roughly 20% below their 2022 peaks. Institutional prudence. The Big Six banks have emerged leaner, having survived the renewal cliff through aggressive amortization extensions and debt restructuring programs that are now standard industry practice. Canada is emerging from the crisis with a more balanced, albeit leaner, economic identity. The era of easy credit has ended, replaced by a national focus on productivity, fiscal prudence, and the slow, steady work of rebuilding the middle class without the crutch of over-leverage. By the dawn of 2027, the slow puncture has successfully deflated the speculative excesses of the early 2020s without a total collapse of the financial system. The Bank of Canada's steady hand at 2.25% throughout 2026 provided the necessary predictability for the market to bottom out. In Toronto and Vancouver, the condo correction has finally settled, with aggregate prices roughly 20% below their pandemic peaks, while the Prairies and Quebec City have emerged as the new engines of national residential stability. The most significant change, however, is not in the price of wood and glass, but in the quality of growth. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Canada's GDP growth is being driven by business investment and exports rather than residential investment. This is the productivity pivot. As capital fled the low-yield, high-risk real estate sector, it found a home in the country's burgeoning AI-integrated manufacturing and green energy corridors. The national household debt-to-income ratio, which once flirted with 185%, has begun a structural descent toward 160%, signaling a country that is finally learning to live within its means. The 2027 legacy. The death of the flip. Real estate has returned to its historical role as a low-volatility, long-term asset. The era of double-digit annual gains is viewed by a new generation of buyers as a fever dream that nearly broke the social contract. Institutional evolution. Canadian banks have transitioned from mortgage factories to more diversified commercial lenders, forced by a market that no longer has the appetite for extreme leverage. A new social baseline.
While the wealthy-poor phenomenon of 2026 left scars, it also catalyzed a massive wave of missing middle construction, duplexes, and townhomes that are finally meeting the needs of young families who were previously priced out. Canada enters 2027 not as the debt-fueled outlier of the G7, but as a nation that survived its greatest financial test with a newfound, if sober, resilience. The crisis didn't end with a bang or a whimper, it ended with a reset.
As 2026 comes to a close, the structural productivity crisis that haunted the early decade is finally being met with a coordinated policy response. The Bank of Canada, having successfully navigated the trade-induced volatility of 2025, enters 2027 with the policy rate held firm at 2.25%. This stability is the bedrock of the new normal. While GDP growth is modest, projected to strengthen to 1.7% by 2027, the quality of that growth is shifting. For the first time in years, business investment is expected to outpace residential investment as a primary driver of the economy. The shift from speculation to innovation. The capital realignment. With the easy money era of real estate over, domestic capital is migrating. The federal government's full-court press on regulatory reform is finally catalyzing investment in digital technologies and AI-integrated manufacturing. The labor market rebalance. Although the unemployment rate is expected to hover around 6.2% to 6.8% during the transition, the focus has shifted toward high-value sectors. Recess-proofing is the new career strategy, with a surge in workers entering specialized trades and green energy corridors. The population plateau. Lower immigration targets through 2027 are helping to ease the immediate pressure on housing demand and infrastructure, allowing the supply of missing middle housing to slowly catch up. The Canada of 2027 is a nation in the midst of a profound identity shift. The wealth effect of rising home prices has been replaced by a productivity push. It is a leaner, more disciplined economy, where the focus has moved from the size of one's mortgage to the output of one's industry. The era of the housing-led economy is ending. The era of the resilient, innovation-led economy is just beginning. As the narrative of the Canadian Great Reset comes to a close, the data from late 2025 and projections for 2026 suggest a nation entering a period of forced stability. The Bank of Canada, having settled its policy rate at 2.25% in December 2025, has signaled a long-term hold, a neutral stance that aims to balance a fragile recovery against persistent core inflation risks. This isn't just an interest rate story, it is a fundamental shift in the Canadian contract. The productivity pivot is now a matter of national survival. With housing no longer serving as the primary engine of wealth, capital is being redirected toward innovation, while the labor market adjusts to a reality where wage growth must be earned through output rather than simply chasing the rising cost of living. Final takeaway: the new normal. The 2026 mortgage renewal cliff will be the final stress test for millions of households. While the payment shock of 15 to 20% is inevitable for those coming off pandemic-era fixed rates, the stabilizing interest rate environment provides a clear, albeit difficult, path forward. Canada is moving away from being a debt-fueled outlier toward a more disciplined, productivity-focused economy. The slow puncture has done its work. The bubble didn't burst, it was exhaled. As we move into 2027, the focus for every Canadian household and business will be the same: rebuilding on a foundation of reality rather than leverage. By mid-2026, the mortgage cliff has transformed from a theoretical threat into a daily reality for approximately 2.4 million Canadian households. The Bank of Canada's decision to hold the policy rate at 2.25% through the first half of the year has provided a floor for the economy, but it has not eliminated the payment shock. Data from early 2026 shows that the median mortgage debt service ratio has climbed to 18%, a historic high.
For the 40% of homeowners who locked in 5-year fixed rates during the pandemic lows of 2021, the renewal experience is a sharp awakening. Average monthly payments are jumping by 15 to 20%. For a household with a $500,000 mortgage, this represents a $500 to $600 monthly increase, effectively a tax on middle-class consumption that is cooling the retail sector nationwide. The 2026 regional divergence. The national numbers mask a widening rift between provinces. While the slow puncture continues in the high-leverage hubs, other regions are finding a new equilibrium. The GTA and Vancouver reckoning. Prices in these ultra-expensive markets are projected to dip by another 3.5 to 4.5% in 2026. The condo sector remains the canary in the coal mine, with high inventory levels as investors exit units that no longer break even. The Prairie and Quebec resilience. Markets like Calgary, Edmonton, and Quebec City are outperforming the national average. Driven by relative affordability and a Buy Canadian industrial push, Quebec City is forecast to see price gains as high as 12%. The Carney effect. The federal government's $13 billion Build Canada Homes initiative has begun breaking ground on its first 4,000 units. While too small to move the needle on immediate prices, the program has signaled a shift towards state-led, factory-built housing as a permanent fixture of the Canadian supply chain. As we move toward the fall of 2026, the wealth effect has been replaced by a liquidity mindset. Canadians are no longer asking how much their home is worth on paper, but how much cash flow they can preserve. The era of the speculative flip is dead. The era of the sustainable mortgage has arrived.
The summer of 2026 marks the definitive end of the amateur landlord era in Canada's largest cities. In Toronto and Vancouver, the market is witnessing a significant investor exodus. Recent surveys show that nearly 35% of Canadians now believe condos are a poor investment, a sentiment shift driven by 3 years of negative cash flow and stagnant appreciation. As thousands of units, originally purchased as pre-construction dreams in 2021, finally hit the secondary market, inventory levels have reached a decade high. This glut has created a unique window for first-time buyers who have spent years on the sidelines, though many remain hesitant, waiting to see if the slow puncture has further to go. The 2026 labor pivot, recess-proofing the workforce. While the real estate sector cools, the Canadian labor market is undergoing a structural realignment. The low-hire, low-fire environment of 2025 has evolved into a highly targeted search for specialized resilience. The skilled trades boom. With approximately 700,000 retirements expected in the trades by 2028, 2026 has become the year of the trade pivot. Salaries for journeyperson electricians and HVAC technicians now often exceed those of entry to mid-level tech roles, reaching $85,000 to $110,000 in high-demand regions like the BC Interior and Southern Ontario. The AI integration era. The tech sector has moved past the AI hype and into AI implementation. Demand is skyrocketing for AI analysts and cybersecurity engineers, as 98% of Canadian IT departments prioritize digital transformation to combat slowing productivity. Healthcare stability. Healthcare remains the ultimate recess-proof sector, with an urgent need for 117,000 additional workers nationally. This is the primary driver of regional stability in cities like Quebec City and Ottawa, where public sector and healthcare employment provide a buffer against the broader economic slowdown. Canada enters the latter half of 2026 with a clear directive. The path to financial security is no longer through the passive income of a rental property, but through the active value of specialized, high-demand skills.
By early 2027, the generation of the shared roof has moved from a temporary survival tactic to a structural fixture of the Canadian economy. Statistics Canada data confirms that over 9.5 million Canadians are now living in multigenerational or intergenerational households. This shift is fundamentally altering the flow of capital. Instead of young families sending 40% of their income to a bank for a new mortgage, they are pooling resources with parents to renovate existing homes. The renovation economy has become a rare bright spot. With the introduction of the multi-generational home renovation tax credit, we are seeing a surge in laneway housing and secondary suite developments. This densification from within is creating a more resilient middle class. These households are 5 times less likely to live in low-income status than those living alone, as they share the burden of utilities, property taxes, and grocery bills. The 2027 productivity push. As the housing-led economy recedes, Canada is finally addressing its productivity gap through a trio of high-growth sectors. The AI deployment wave. 2026 was the year AI moved from theory to deployment. In 2027, Canadian businesses are seeing measurable gains in efficiency. New AI compute hubs in Quebec and Ontario, fueled by low-carbon energy, are attracting global firms, creating a new class of high-wage technical roles. Modern Methods of Construction, MMC. The federal agency Build Canada Homes has successfully catalyzed a prefabricated housing industry. By treating home building like automotive manufacturing, Canada is finally lowering the cost per square foot of new supply, aiming to bypass the labor shortages that plagued traditional construction. The Green Corridor exports. With global trade shifting toward carbon accountability, Canada's exports of critical minerals and green steel are seeing a 15% year-over-year increase. The transition is painful but purposeful. The slow puncture of the housing bubble has effectively rerouted billions of dollars into these productive assets. Canada enters the spring of 2027 as a hybrid economy, one that still values the safety of home ownership, but no longer relies on it as the sole engine of national prosperity. The year 2027 marks the dawn of the new Canadian social contract. After years of economic turbulence, the nation has moved past the shock of the 2026 renewal wave and settled into a more disciplined, intergenerational financial model. The wealth reset of this era is defined by a shift from individual home equity accumulation to a collective family wealth strategy. The retiree reckoning, living on equity. For Canada's retirees, the 2027 landscape is one of sober realization. The Great Wealth Transfer, estimated at over $1 trillion between 2023 and 2026, has occurred more through necessity than choice. The Bank of Mom and Dad 2.0. Instead of traditional inheritances, wealth is being front-loaded. Seniors are increasingly liquidating portions of their home equity to provide survival gifts to children struggling with high interest rates, effectively choosing to see their heirs settled now rather than leaving a windfall later. Phased retirement. As longevity increases and the cost of living remains elevated, the hard stop at age 65 is disappearing. In 2027, over 30% of Canadians over 65 remain in the workforce part-time, not just for financial stability, but to stay connected to the productivity pivot economy. The young professional reality, the tenure of skill. For Gen Z and millennials, the 2027 reset has changed the definition of success. The obsession with getting on the ladder at any cost has been replaced by a focus on career mobility and liquidity. The renting to invest shift. With home prices plateauing, a new class of professional renters has emerged. These individuals prefer to keep their capital in high-growth, AI-integrated sectors or liquid index funds rather than tying it up in a stagnant residential asset. The skill as equity mindset. In the 2027 labor market, high-demand technical and trade certifications are viewed as more stable assets than a 5% down payment. The new social baseline is about output over ownership. A nation rebalanced.
By the end of 2027, the slow puncture has achieved what years of policy couldn't. It has decoupled the Canadian identity from the housing market. The nation is leaner, more productive, and more intergenerationally connected. While the scars of the 2025-2026 crisis remain, they have become the foundation of a more resilient, reality-based economy. Canada is no longer a country of housing-rich, cash-poor citizens. It is a nation of productivity-rich, debt-aware survivors.